Okay, so I no doubt have just filled you with an absolute ton of information and a broad brush painting of Marx's writings. Now let me just say for long stretches of time after that, even well into the 1960s, there were a lot of scholars in the Western world that were trying to figure out how we take these pretty provocative but broad ideas of Marx and actually get them to help us understand the way culture works in the world. The reading from Raymond Williams that I assigned for this week is difficult. There's a lot going on in that reading. The part of the lecture that I just gave will help you to understand some of the basics of what he's doing. But what he is doing is he's going back into actual writings from Marx, and Williams is writing, I think the date on that is like in the 1950s. He's going back to Marxist readings, and he's saying, you know what? There's been a tendency by people that came after Marx to be too, the word we would use is deterministic, to try and draw too direct of an arrow from the base up to the superstructure. And Williams is saying life is a lot more complicated than that. Not only life, but the actual base, so actually describing the relations between owners and workers and the nature of work is a lot more difficult than we think it is. And it's also kind of overstepping to say that the superstructure is all just one coherent cultural thing that somehow pops up from the base in that arrow that I used to describe Marx's argument. So Williams is an interpreter of Marx, and what he's trying to do is clarify Marx's ideas so that we can use them more to understand the relation of culture and society. He identifies in that reading, he first goes through and points out, and this is pretty cool, he says, well, if you actually read Marx, and there's a lot of Marx to read, you could read for a couple years and not finish all of Marx's writings, he says, you find that Marx actually use words like base and superstructure, and he notes that those are translated differently in other languages other than English, because Marx wrote mostly in German. Williams says you find terms like base and superstructure, but you find Marx uses them in differing ways throughout the body of his works. So what Williams is saying, what we have to do is understand a little bit more of the points Marx is trying to make, and then we can use those points in helping us to think about culture and society. In particular, Williams kind of asks, he's kind of asking rhetorically this question, how do we see the superstructure? Or how would we know the superstructure? What will we look at to investigate this idea of the superstructure and the reflection theory? So this idea that the superstructure reflects the economy, the base, but also mystifies it so that we don't really understand, or we think that ideas are driving history instead of the reality, as Marx argued, that the most important thing is to understand economic forces. So Williams suggests that we look at a couple things. In particular, he thinks we should look at institutions. So this would be something such as law, marriage, religion. He suggests looking at forms of consciousness. So generally this is kind of the way people think about the nature of the social world. So this could be folk ideas, it could be different trends and thinking about the world, things like that. And he also says look at political and what he calls cultural practices. We can just say we can say cultural practices. And what he would mean by that is things like what are the popular political ideas of the day, what are the political platforms, what are the different art movements of the time period, what are people maybe reading, what are the things that people kind of do in their daily life, what are the popular forms of culture. And he says this whole big sexy Marxist term superstructure is too clunky, and Williams says what we should do is instead look at these different pieces of the superstructure when we're going to try and use a Marxist approach to understanding culture. And then even more importantly, he's saying we need to also realize that this relationship of base and superstructure, which I drew with one arrow, is not as simple as that. So, for one thing, both of these things, which seem solid in this diagram, are constantly changing. There's constantly stuff going on in economics. Geez, just wake up and pay attention to the last 4 years of what's happened in our own economy. And so we have to think about this as a dynamic kind of process, and hence what's up here in the superstructure is kind of a dynamic process. And then not only that, so not only is there kind of change and dynamism going on, but these very ideas, these forms of consciousness, these cultural practices, these institutions, such as law, as I've kept mentioning, actually help to constitute the base. So they keep the base going, if you will. They keep it in a particular mode of production until something happens that drastically changes that mode of production. Now, Marx thought capitalism was on its way out within like 40 years. By the early 1900s, he probably would have guessed. We've learned that that's not necessarily the case, but his point is still the same, which is that this superstructure has a role in kind of a continuing, ongoing role in keeping the base going and legitimating the base and making the base seem natural and seem real and seem the only way that the world could be. So what Williams is saying is, Marx is onto something, but we need to maybe specify some of Marx's thoughts a little bit more so we can actually use them in our research. And this is where the List and Pope reading comes in. Now, one other topic that Marx wrote about in relation to our topic today is he wrote about religion. And if anybody of you know anything about Marx, Marx is absolutely no friend of religion. Marx considered religion to be a part of the superstructure, so basically a system of behavior and ideas and a place of power and intellectuals that obscured reality, flipped it upside down, and kind of mystified people from being able to understand that religious ideas and religious beliefs didn't drive history, but instead economic relations did. So he was definitely no friend of religion. Marx said things like religion was an opiate, which basically would be the equivalent of saying religion was like crystal meth. Religion was operated as an escape. It just numbed people, stopped them from thinking about the nature of the base. And so in this way, religion is a core part of ideology. Ideology being that systematic explanation that characterizes the superstructure's ability to kind of mystify reality. So I'll insert here a quick slide right here. Where we have quotes from Marx about religion, such as, and I'll read a couple here, the ones that I just put up there, man makes religion. Religion does not make man. Well, if you think about that base superstructure thing that we just talked about, that makes total sense. Man, which in his sense was the deepest part of reality, what humanity did in moments of producing in the economy, creates religion superstructure. All right, so in a Marxist system, you can understand where that comes from. So he's implicitly arguing that God's an invention of kind of people who have this camera obscura thing going, where they're not seeing what's real reality, but they have this force that helps them now in this set of ideas and religious practices to kind of escape from reality. And then Marx also says that religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the sentiment of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. So he's basically saying that kind of religion kind of gives a nice kind of shiny sheen on just how bad things are in the base. And it can prevent people from seeing what's going on in the base. Now, before any of you, religious believer or not, object to that and say, that's kind of crazy. And I should be really clear, I'm also a sociologist of religion, and Marx got a lot wrong about religion. Think for a moment about where he might be right. So for example, in India, still to this day, despite being outlawed in the 1950s, the caste system survives. And the caste system, one of the biggest legitimating forces for the caste system is deep Hindu ideas about rebirth and moving through levels of reality with each rebirth. And so that legitimates that idea system of saying, oh, people will be reborn on their next life, they can make a move up, and then we'll all eventually be at the top of the caste system. That set of ideas helps to legitimate the reality of that economic and political system that is at the base of society there. Or think for a second of the Roman Catholic Church in the 15 and 1600s, where economic forces of coming to the New World, committing genocide, expropriating natural wealth here, and destroying cultures and land here were made sense of through ideas of bringing salvation to people who are ignorant and worshiping inauthentic or even evil deities. Or today there's been an explosion in the last 10 years in this country in what is known as the prosperity gospel movement in Christianity, which is a form of religion that tries to read into the Christian tradition that God's promise to people is that material wealth will come. Well, in a Marxist explanation again, that isn't that surprising that a superstructure, a cultural set of beliefs like that would become very popular in a time where there's lots of social instability, there's rising inequality, dropping real wages, and a lot more kind of anxiety about economic conditions, creating a tendency or a desire to a system that legitimizes inequality by saying, it's part of God's plan. So you can see that actually Marx's ideas can be helpful in some way. And actually, the Liston Pope reading is a great example of that. Liston Pope was a sociologist writing this book about a town called Gastonia, that was his name for it, in the South in the 1920s, I believe. And it was a mill town, and a mill is when there used to be like textile mills, kind of big manufacturing plants for clothing in the South. And what Pope is doing in this short snippet I gave you to read is he's using kind of a Marxist reading about how religion operates in that community. And lo and behold, what does Pope find? Well, he looks at specifically, he kind of looks at religion in three different areas, but you can really focus on, he looks at churches in the uptown, which is where the mill owners live, and he looks at churches out in the mill areas, in other words, where the workers lives. And he finds in both of those locations, the religious teachings and the way people look can differ some, but in both locations, religion can potentially be a system that prevents people from realizing just how incredibly unjust the mills are, how bad the working conditions are, how impoverished people are except working all the time, and how unequal the outcomes of that work are. And he helps us to see that actually some of Marx's ideas about how the superstructure can legitimate and cover over and justify the reality of economics is true. Let me go ahead and pause there for a second. But actually, before I pause, let me say Marx was wrong about a lot of things in religion. So don't walk away from this thinking that, holy crap, Marx showed us that there's no such thing as God, and any idea of God certainly is just a reflection of the base. That's a Marxist argument about religion. There's a lot of other ideas or ways to think about religion, but at least in a case like Liston Pope shows us in the reading, some of these ideas about the relationship between the base and superstructure do help us to understand culture and society. All right, I'll be right back for the last segment.